The small town of Ashford Hollow seemed to hold the air that early morning when Caleb Whitmore, a very devout Christian man recognized by the community as someone firm in faith and morals, had been burning with fever for days. The room where he lay seemed smaller, cramped by the heat his body relentlessly released. Around the bed, his family watched his every move as if each breath could be his last. The irregular sound emanating from Caleb's chest dominated everything, making it clear that something serious was happening. It felt like time was dragging on while his life seemed to slip away. At the foot of the bed lay Margaret Whitmore, Caleb's wife, trying to wipe the sweat from his face with a cloth that was almost always too damp. She barely recognized the man who had always been so solid, so full of convictions, now lost in a fever that no medicine could alleviate. The couple's two sons, Ethan and Samuel, watched in silence, unable to understand why their father, so strong and present, was writhing like that. The air in the room had a heavy smell of herbs, medicine and despair, creating an almost suffocating atmosphere. Every gesture seemed small in the face of the gravity that grew with each passing minute. At the table, Dr. Charles Hammond, the local physician and an old acquaintance of the family, tried to maintain the composure of someone who still believed he had control of the situation. He had spent hours applying what he knew, measuring the fever, adjusting compresses, preparing simple mixtures that usually helped, but nothing had any effect. Caleb murmured fragmented psalms, mixed with words that no one could understand, as if his mind were trapped in a distant place. The doctor had seen high fevers before, but never anything that burned with such intensity without any apparent cause. When he finally turned to the family, his face betrayed what his voice had tried to soften. He explained, with exaggerated caution, that Caleb's condition was not responding to any treatment. He said his body was beginning to fail, and there wasn't much to do but wait. Margaret felt her legs tremble as Ethan held his younger brother, trying to keep him steady. The doctor slowly gathered his instruments, as if delaying the end of that visit might change something. But it couldn't. As soon as he left the house, silence seemed to settle in like another presence in the room. The family drew closer to Caleb, watching his body tremble in rapid spasms, as if fighting against something invisible. His irregular breathing made his chest rise and fall in a frightening way. Each of his whispers seemed to carry a plea for help that no one knew how to answer. And when the word that no one wanted to face echoed in everyone's memory, irreversible, a silent question also arose. How far were they willing to go to prevent that night from being his last? When Dr. Charles Hammond left the house, his face showing the defeated expression of someone who had run out of answers, the silence became almost a weight on the Whitmore family. Margaret Whitmore, Caleb's wife, remained seated beside the bed, watching her husband rave between incoherent psalms. The heat emanating from him seemed even more intense now that all medical hope had been withdrawn. Ethan Whitmore, the eldest son, paced back and forth trying to contain his despair, while Samuel, the youngest, clung to the wall as if trying to disappear into it. It was then that Margaret, her voice low as if she feared being overheard by anyone outside her family, uttered a name she never imagined she would let slip from her lips: Rowena Blackwood, the healer who lived on the edge of the pine forest. Rowena was known in the town not as a friend of the church, but as someone who carried ancient knowledge passed down through generations. The mention of her name made Ethan stop immediately, as if the ground had pushed his feet down. Margaret felt her own heart pound, overcome with guilt even before any discussion had begun. The idea of calling the healer had always been a source of silent debate among the residents of Ashford Hollow. Some saw her as a wise woman. Others, influenced by the local church, believed her methods went against everything they considered sacred. Caleb, being one of the most devout men in the community, never allowed such practices to even be mentioned in his home. He was known for defending his faith with unwavering conviction and never allowed room for beliefs that extended beyond the traditional practices of the church. Therefore, hearing Rowena's name there, in the early hours of the morning, seemed almost a betrayal of his values. Ethan, still shocked, asked his mother if that made sense, reminding her that Caleb himself would have refused that possibility in any other situation. Margaret, however, looked at her husband and saw another spasm run through his body, making the mattress tremble slightly. Caleb's face was red, wet with sweat, and his eyes moved rapidly under closed eyelids, as if fighting against something neither of them could reach. Faced with that image, Margaret realized that the choices she would never make were being forced by the circumstances that now dominated everything. Rowena Blackwood's name hung in the air, laden with prohibitions, fears, and possibilities no one wanted to admit. The family looked at each other, each waiting for someone else to take responsibility for that bold step. Margaret felt something was about to break, as if an invisible line stretched between Caleb's faith and his survival. Deep down, everyone understood that this fever had already crossed the line of what was understandable. And as the heat in the room became almost unbearable, it became clear that this decision, however forbidden, might be the only one left, even if it meant facing what Caleb feared most. When Margaret repeated Rowena's name, Caleb's reaction was immediate and almost frightening. Even immersed in the fever that had consumed him for days, he opened his eyes abruptly, as if his consciousness had fought to return just to prevent that decision from going ahead. His arm tried to rise, trembling, weak, but carrying a clear protest. The entire room seemed to hold its breath at this unexpected movement, as if everyone there had been caught off guard by the way he reacted to the mere sound of that name. Caleb's voice came out hoarse, choked by fever, but the words were as firm as his body allowed. He murmured that he didn't want witchcraft, repeating the word as if it burned even more than the heat that overwhelmed him. He mixed fragments of prayers, snippets of what he remembered by heart, as if trying to protect himself from the idea of accepting something he had always rejected. It was difficult to know where his faith ended and fear began, because the two seemed to blend together as he tried to speak, trembling with weakness. Ethan approached his father carefully, saying that no one had decided anything yet, trying to bring calm to an atmosphere already on the verge of despair. But Caleb seemed unable to hear a word. His face was red, drenched in sweat, and his eyes darted rapidly beneath his eyelids, as if he were trapped somewhere between consciousness and delirium. Margaret watched every detail, feeling her heart clench. It was like witnessing a silent struggle between the faith that had guided Caleb his entire life and the harsh reality that was increasingly crushing him. Suddenly, a violent spasm shot through Caleb's body, arching him in a way that made Samuel take a step back, startled. The mattress sank and trembled with the force of that unexpected movement. The groan that escaped Caleb was low, but laden with pain and exhaustion, as if his body were giving way to something no one there could see. Sweat dripped in thick drops, running down his chin and soaking the sheet, while his breath became erratic. It was clear that the fever was advancing unchecked. When the spasm subsided, he fell back onto the pillow, too weak to speak. The family stood motionless as if they had just witnessed something life-changing. His refusal was there, clear, painful, but it was also evident that his condition was deteriorating too rapidly to wait for a comfortable solution. The silence that filled the room seemed to demand an urgent decision, even if no one dared to say it aloud. And as the night wore on, it became increasingly clear that this discussion could not continue much longer. The room remained silent after Caleb's last spasm, as if everyone there was trying to understand what to do in a situation that was beyond the limits of what they knew. Margaret looked at her husband, seeing his breathing waver irregularly, weakly, almost begging for a solution that didn't yet exist. The cloth in her hands could no longer absorb so much sweat, and she felt the fabric quickly becoming scalding. The heat emanating from his body was so intense that it seemed impossible for a human being to endure it for much longer. Something inside her knew that this early morning couldn't end the way it was. Ethan watched his mother, waiting for any sign of a decision, but he knew she was struggling internally. Caleb's faith had always been the foundation of the family, and the idea of going against what he stood for seemed like a huge transgression. Still, the image of him lying there, lost in delirium and pain, made it impossible to ignore what was unfolding before everyone's eyes. Samuel remained near the door, motionless, his face tense, pressing his hands together as if trying to stop the fear from spreading throughout his body. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the heavy air slowly enter and leave, almost painfully. She looked at Caleb again, wondering what he would say if he were conscious enough to participate in the decision. But she also knew that, in that state, any choice needed to be made by someone capable of seeing beyond his religious convictions. The fever completely overwhelmed him, erasing who he was and leaving only a body desperate for relief. Her conscience began to weigh on her, because every second of hesitation seemed to bring him closer to a dangerously low point. Looking at Ethan, Margaret finally broke the silence. Her voice was low, trembling, but determined. She said it was time to find Rowena, even if it meant confronting what Caleb had always rejected. The phrase hung in the air, laden with guilt, love, and despair. Ethan took a few moments to absorb it. It was the first time he had seen his mother openly contradict her husband's principles, but he understood. The need was too urgent to ignore. This wasn't a choice against his faith, but for his life, and that was the only way to justify something so difficult. Before dawn arrived, Ethan grabbed his coat and left through the door without looking back. The cold darkness of the early morning enveloped his body, but he didn't hesitate, moving towards the forest where Rowena lived. Inside the house, Margaret remained beside Caleb, watching his short, disordered breaths. She knew that what was about to happen could change much more than his health, and, as the house seemed to shrink and the air thicker, the feeling grew that this decision would open doors that could never be closed again. Before illness took over everything, Caleb was remembered as a solid figure, a role model in the small town of Ashford Hollow. From a young age, he carried a serious demeanor, driven by a sense of responsibility that many admired. He participated in almost all church activities, always willing to help, to organize services, to guide anyone who needed a word of faith. His firm, sometimes rigid manner was seen as part of the commitment he always demonstrated to what he believed in. For him, living was about following principles, and each day was a chance to reaffirm that. Caleb grew up hearing stories about the importance of staying away from practices considered dangerous or deceptive. His family always reinforced that alternative paths should be avoided, as they could lead one's heart astray from God. These beliefs shaped his worldview, creating very clear boundaries between what he considered sacred and what he believed to be a threat. Over time, these boundaries became so firm that anything that fell outside his spiritual understanding was promptly rejected, leaving no room for questioning. Even so, those who knew Caleb knew that behind that rigid demeanor was a man of sincere intentions. He sought to protect his family, maintain a stable life, and preserve what he considered right. His faith wasn't displayed outwardly, but lived out daily, in simple gestures. In the nights he stayed awake, silently reading the Bible. He was someone who deeply believed that what is right would always stand on its own merits, as long as it was defended with conviction. For many, this seriousness brought security. For others, it created a difficult distance to cross. Over time, however, this rigidity also brought challenges. Margaret at times felt that her husband's inflexible stance prevented more open conversations, especially when it came to topics that went beyond the boundaries of the church. Ethan, already maturing, saw his father as someone of integrity, but sometimes stuck in ideas that didn't reflect the world around him. Still, neither of them doubted the love Caleb held for his family, even when that love was expressed through rules and convictions that he believed were the right way to protect everyone. Now, with fever consuming him, it was impossible to ignore the irony of it all. Caleb's life, built on such firm foundations, was being threatened by something none of his principles could explain or confront. And as the night wore on, and Ethan sought help in the forest, the question no one dared to voice gained strength. What would happen when Caleb discovered that his survival depended precisely on what he had spent his entire life rejecting? It all began so discreetly that no one imagined it could turn into the nightmare that now gripped the house. Caleb had returned from a visit to the woods after helping a neighbor with some simple tasks. It was the kind of help he offered without a second thought, driven by the sense of duty he always carried. When he returned, he only mentioned a strange tiredness, as if his body felt too heavy for an ordinary day. Margaret believed it was just exhaustion and prepared a hot meal, hoping a good rest would solve everything. The following morning, however, something seemed out of place. Caleb woke up with a slight fever, nothing alarming, but enough to make him sluggish and his mind wander. He tried to ignore the discomfort, insisting on carrying out his tasks as he always did. However, throughout the day, the fever did not subside. The compresses applied by Margaret only provided relief for a few minutes, and soon the heat returned with the same intensity. Still, no one imagined that this small change would be the beginning of something so quick and devastating. On the second day, the fever ceased to be merely an uncomfortable sensation and became a constant, firm, almost aggressive presence. Caleb no longer had the strength to get up as before and had to remain lying down, something unusual for someone so disciplined and resilient. The doctor was called for the first time, believing it might be a simple infection. He examined him, asked questions, tried to find any injury or external sign that would explain his condition. He found nothing. His body was intact, but burning from the inside in a way that intrigued him. Prayers also began that same day, offered by family and some church members who came to offer support. Everyone believed the fever would soon subside, like common colds that pass with rest and faith. But Caleb began to oscillate between moments of lucidity and confusion, as if his mind were trying to keep up with what his body could no longer sustain. It wasn't yet the deep delirium that would come later, but there were already signs that something more serious was approaching, something that no one there knew how to deal with. What no one realized at the beginning was the speed at which the disease progressed. In just 2 days, the fever ceased to be an unwelcome visitor and became an enemy that occupied every space in Caleb's body. What had seemed like a simple malaise turned into a persistent, stubborn heat, resistant to everything. And while the family tried to understand what was happening, the disease seemed to gain ground silently, preparing the way for the storm that would soon come, a storm that would put everything Caleb believed in to the test. In the following days, Caleb's fever ceased to be merely high and began to come in waves so intense that they seemed to set the rhythm for the entire house. With each new wave, his body reacted as if trying to escape a heat of unclear origin. His chest rose and fell erratically, and the murmurs escaping his mouth were no longer complete sentences, but loose fragments mixed with rapid breaths. It seemed as if he were trapped between two worlds, unable to fully settle in either. The doctor returned several times, trying to find explanations, but the situation became more perplexing with each visit. There was no infection, no injuries, no external signs to justify such a decompensation. Caleb's skin varied between extreme redness and an almost frightening pallor, as if his body were fighting a battle that no one could see. Each attempt to treat him was met with a challenge by the fever, and it seemed to respond with even more force, in a cycle that no one knew how to break. The nights were the worst. Caleb would wake up startled, repeating passages from Psalms he remembered from childhood, but soon his words would become disjointed sounds, almost impossible to understand. Sometimes he would call out for people who weren't there. At other times he seemed not to recognize those around him. Margaret tried to hold him by the shoulders, but she had the feeling of holding someone who was rapidly slipping away, as if her consciousness were slipping away along with the sweat that soaked the sheets. Ethan and Samuel took turns at the bedside, each trying to bear the anguish as best they could. It was difficult to watch their father, always so firm, succumb to involuntary movements that left him arched, hunched, contorted. There were moments when Caleb would be completely still, breathing so weakly he seemed about to disappear. Then, his whole body would tremble as if a shock had run through his muscles. Nothing made sense, and this lack of logic made everything even more alarming. It was during one of those early mornings that Margaret realized the situation had gone beyond any imaginable limit. It wasn't just an unusual fever. It was something that seemed to consume Caleb from the inside out, pushing him into a state none of them recognized. And although no one said it aloud, they all felt the same growing fear. If this continued, perhaps not even the dawn would be able to bring him back. The whole house seemed to be waiting for something, the final collapse or an improbable miracle. Time seemed to have stood still when Ethan finally reappeared at the door of the house, his face marked by the cold of the early morning and the haste of the walk. Behind him appeared Rowena Blackwood, the forest healer, walking with firm steps, as if she were accustomed to crossing the darkness without hesitation. Her presence filled the room with a different silence, heavy but not threatening. She entered without showing fear or doubt, only observing attentively every detail around her, as if the air of the room already told her part of what she needed to know. Rowena was taller than Margaret remembered and wore a dark shawl that seemed to carry the scent of the forest, mixed with dried herbs. Her eyes were calm yet attentive and seemed to see beyond what was visible. Upon reaching the bedside, she didn't ask long questions or seek explanations. She simply leaned down and lightly touched Caleb's forehead, as if the contact were enough to understand his condition. The gesture was simple, but the family watched expectantly, as if some sign of hope might emerge from it. The room seemed different with the healer present. Caleb's breathing was still uneven, but the atmosphere seemed more stable, almost as if Rowena had brought with her a kind of silent order. Margaret watched everything with a heavy heart, torn between the guilt of having called someone who contradicted her husband's beliefs and the relief of finally seeing someone who didn't seem frightened by the gravity of the situation. For her, it was a strange mixture of fear and hope, as if she were taking a step into unknown but necessary territory. Rowena kept her fingers on Caleb's forehead for a few seconds that seemed far too long. Her eyes were closed, and she breathed slowly, intently, as if she were listening to something only she could perceive. Ethan and Samuel exchanged nervous glances, trying to understand what that woman saw, felt, or interpreted. The silence was so dense that every small movement of Caleb seemed to echo in the space, revealing that some change was about to happen. Good or bad, no one knew. When Rowena finally withdrew her hand, she opened her eyes and took a step back, letting out a soft sigh. She didn't seem surprised, but deeply certain of what she had just realized. She turned to Margaret, her expression firm, as if she were about to say something that would change everything. The family leaned in to listen, sensing that this moment would mark the beginning of something none of them could foresee, something that might decide whether Caleb would have another sunrise. Rowena remained silent for a few moments after removing her hand from Caleb's forehead, as if she were internalizing something difficult to translate. Her eyes scanned his face, attentive to every spasm, every change in his breathing. When she finally looked back at Margaret, her expression was firm but not alarmed. She took a deep breath before speaking, like someone who knew her words might be hard to accept. The family, still tense, awaited any explanation that made sense. In a low voice, Rowena stated that this was no ordinary bodily ailment. She said that the heat consuming Caleb didn't come from outside, but from within, as if he were trapped in a space from which he could find no escape. She explained that when this happened, the body reacted by trying to release this energy, but without success, resulting in fevers that did not respond to medicine or prayers. She didn't speak in a mystical or theatrical tone. She spoke like someone accustomed to seeing beyond what ordinary eyes perceive. For her, this was an ancient imbalance, rare, but not impossible to treat. Ethan frowned, trying to understand how something could burn from the inside without being an infection. For the first time, Rowena looked directly at him and added that, in the woods, certain places carry forces that don't always show themselves immediately. She said that sometimes sensitive or spiritually rigid people absorb this type of energy more intensely. Caleb, according to her, hadn't been able to release it, and now his body was locked, retaining a heat that had nowhere to escape. It was like trapping fire in a closed container. Margaret felt her stomach churn at the diagnosis, not from disbelief, but from realizing it surpassed anything she had ever known. It was difficult to imagine her husband, so disciplined, so attached to his own convictions, being affected by something that didn't fit into traditional explanations. The idea that his body was retaining heat seemed almost too symbolic, as if Rowena were also describing how Caleb lived, holding on to more than he admitted. But she didn't comment on that. She only listened, her mind divided between faith and despair. Samuel, who until then had remained quiet in a corner, asked if there was a cure. The question echoed through the room, simple, direct, necessary. Rowena took a deep breath before answering that yes, there was a way to release the trapped heat, but the process would not be easy nor comfortable. She said it would require changes in the environment and, above all, permission to act without interference. As she finished, she left a clear warning hanging in the air. This would require courage from everyone. The family exchanged glances, sensing that the next step would not be just a practical decision, but a profound choice, capable of transforming much more than just Caleb's fever. As soon as the family confirmed they wished to continue, Rowena walked slowly around the room, observing everything around her as if every detail mattered. She analyzed the position of the bed, the half-open window, the shadows cast by the dim light of the lamp. After a few seconds, she declared that she would need to adjust the environment before beginning anything. Her voice was calm but firm, making it clear that these changes were not optional. Margaret nodded, even without fully understanding the reason for each instruction. Rowena then asked them to remove all religious symbols from the room. He didn't say this out of disrespect, but rather to avoid energy conflicts, as he carefully explained. Margaret hesitated for a moment, looking at the small cross on the wall and the Bible on the bedside table, objects that were part of the family's routine. It was difficult to imagine that room without these references, but it was also impossible to ignore Caleb's state. With trembling hands, she gathered everything up, while her children helped her silently as if they were handling something too sacred. After that, Rowena opened the window completely, allowing the cold morning air to enter the room. The contrast between the frigid air and the warmth emanating from Caleb's body created a strange, almost contradictory sensation. She turned off all the artificial lights, plunging the room into a soft darkness. Then she took a thick candle from her bag, made of tallow mixed with dried herbs. Its scent, once lit, spread quickly, filling the space with an earthy aroma, familiar only to those who knew the forest as intimately as she did. The atmosphere in the room changed almost immediately. The silence seemed to deepen, as if the world outside had stepped back a few steps. Ethan watched Rowena's every move attentively, trying to understand the purpose of it all. Samuel, more sensitive, felt a shiver run down his spine, not from fear, but from a feeling that something unusual was about to begin. Rowena approached the bed again, gently adjusting Caleb's body position without causing discomfort, but preparing him as one organizes the center of a carefully planned ritual. When everything was ready, Rowena took a step back and observed the surroundings one last time. The candlelight flickered, casting soft shadows on the walls, creating a scene that seemed to exist between the natural and the inexplicable. She then turned to Margaret and asked if they were ready to move on. The question, though simple, carried the weight of the unknown. The family's hearts beat faster because from that moment on, there would be no turning back, and what happened there would determine whether Caleb had any chance of surviving. The room, now transformed by Rowena's careful preparation, seemed to carry a different kind of silence. The candlelight illuminated Caleb's face, revealing his constant sweat and unsteady breathing. Margaret watched everything with a racing heart, torn between the hope that something might finally help him and the discomfort of being about to allow something he had always considered forbidden. The faith that had sustained the family for so many years seemed to tremble in her hands, as if it were being tested in a way she never imagined facing. Margaret's hesitation became evident when Rowena asked her to move slightly away from the bed so as not to interfere with the flow of energy she intended to release. The request seemed simple, but it carried immense emotional weight. Margaret impulsively grabbed Caleb's arm, feeling his skin so hot it almost burned. The shock of this contact rekindled the urgency of the situation within her. The fever was so intense that ignoring any possibility of help would be indefensible. Even so, the fear of making the wrong decision remained there, heavy with worry. Ethan sensed his mother's dilemma and approached, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He said that, at that moment, the most important thing was to save Caleb, and that any judgment could be discussed later. The words, though simple, gave Margaret the push she needed. She slowly released her husband's arm, as if letting go of something that both protected and held her captive. A feeling of vulnerability overwhelmed her, but it also brought a strange clarity. There was no more room for fear. It was either act or lose the man she loved. Rowena watched the scene attentively, understanding without judgment the emotional conflict that hung in the air. When she saw that Margaret had finally taken a few steps back, she approached Caleb again and placed her hands near his body without touching him. It was as if she were sensing the surrounding area, analyzing the intensity of that inner heat that stubbornly refused to dissipate. The shadows danced on the wall while the candle flickered, creating a scene that seemed to vibrate with its own energy, almost alive, The family remained motionless, awaiting the next move with their hearts in suspense. Margaret, now with her hands clasped in front of her chest, watched the healer and felt something within her shift. It wasn't total acceptance or complete understanding. It was simply the silent realization that, regardless of beliefs, Caleb's life depended on that moment. The tension in the air increased with each passing second, as if the room itself were holding its breath along with them. And as Rowena prepared to begin what she called the decisive act, everyone realized that something important was about to happen, something no one would forget. The air in the room seemed to thicken as Rowena positioned herself beside the bed, holding a small bundle of dried herbs she had taken from her bag. She brought the bundle close to the candle flame, allowing the smoke to slowly rise, creating a trail that spread softly and continuously through the air. The scent of the herbs mingled with the atmosphere, bringing a strange yet welcoming and unfamiliar feeling. The family watched in absolute silence, almost without blinking, as if any movement could break the concentration necessary for what was about to happen. Rowena began to move the hand holding the bundle, tracing shapes in the air that seemed to follow their own rhythm, as if they were not random gestures, but ancient instructions laden with meaning. The words she murmured were low and firm, in a language none of them recognized. It was not a prayer nor a plea. It sounded more like a command, something directed at Caleb's own body. He remained motionless, breathing heavily, but his face seemed to react subtly, as if he were hearing something the others could not perceive. The smoke spread through the room, creating a light veil that made the candlelight dance differently, projecting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Ethan felt a slight pressure in his chest, not of pain, but of expectation, as if he were facing something bigger than he could understand. Margaret, in turn, kept her eyes fixed on Caleb, trying to perceive any significant change, any sign of improvement or worsening. With each movement of the healer, the tension increased, filling the air with an almost palpable sensation. Rowena leaned slightly forward, bringing the herbs closer to Caleb's abdomen, but without touching him. The smoke seemed to be drawn towards him, as if an invisible force were reacting to the ritual. The healer's words became faster, firmer, as if she were entering the most critical part of the practice. The atmosphere became so silent that it was possible to hear the soft crackling of the burning herbs. The sensation that something was being summoned, moved, awakened, made her skin crawl, even without knowing exactly what was happening. For a moment, Caleb seemed to whisper something incomprehensible, as if his mind were trying to keep up with the rhythm of those ancient words. Margaret took an involuntary step forward, but stopped when she felt Ethan hold her hand, reminding her to trust the process. Rowena raised the bundle of herbs slightly, as if she were about to move on to the most delicate part of the ritual. And at that moment, when the smoke seemed to envelop Caleb's entire body, it became clear to everyone that the true breaking point was approaching, the instant when something finally needed to happen. After a few seconds of profound silence, Rowena put away the partially burned bundle of herbs and moved even closer to the bed. Her expression was concentrated, as if she were listening to something that no one else could perceive. Without warning, she shifted the position of her hands, bringing them to Caleb's abdomen, but without touching him directly. The air around them seemed to vibrate with this simple change, as if the movement had awakened something that had been dormant within him. The family held their breath, sensing that this moment would be unlike anything they had ever experienced before. With a firm gesture, Rowena finally placed one hand on Caleb's abdomen, while the other was placed at the base of his spine, a point that seemed strategic. His body reacted immediately, arching as if he had received a sudden impact. The spasm was so strong that Ethan took a step forward, but stopped when he realized that Rowena was keeping her hands there with absolute firmness, showing no fear or surprise. The healer began to murmur again, quick and rhythmic words, as if she were guiding that trapped energy to some specific place. Caleb took a deep breath, gasping for air irregularly, almost desperately. His mouth opened in a muffled groan, and his face, already drenched in sweat, tensed even more. It was as if his body was reacting not only to the touch, but to something happening inside, stirring layers no one had ever reached before. Margaret shrank back, unable to contain the instinct to protect him, even knowing that this process was necessary. The feeling that filled the room was intense, almost electric, as if everyone were connected to the same invisible current. Rowena's hand at the base of Caleb's spine began to make a slight circular motion, while the other pressed more firmly against his abdomen. Anyone who didn't know what was happening would have thought it was just a body technique, but something in the air made it clear there was more to it. The candle flickered strongly, almost going out, and the smoke from the herbs that still lingered in the room seemed to follow the rhythm of Caleb's breathing. It was as if the entire room had entered a state of alert, awaiting the outcome of that touch that seemed to be tearing something from within him. Then it happened. Caleb's body arched again, this time in a more controlled manner, as if releasing long-standing tension. His expression subtly shifted from extreme pain to profound discomfort, almost as if he were about to expel something. Rowena remained steady, guiding the reaction with precision. And when the air in the room seemed heavy enough to be touched, the healer raised her head and said in a low, confident voice that whatever was trapped was beginning to move, and that the next moment would be crucial. The room seemed to hold its breath as Caleb's body began to react in a way no one there had ever witnessed before. The intense heat that had previously been concentrated in his chest and forehead began to spread, coursing across his skin like a slow wave. Margaret noticed first. Her hand, lightly touching Caleb's arm, felt the temperature shift as if something were moving inside. It was strange, almost impossible to explain, but visible to the naked eye. The beads of sweat became even more frequent, forming trails that ran quickly down his face, neck, and stomach. Rowena kept her hand steady, guiding that internal movement as if she were steering a current trying to go the wrong way. Her expression was serious, but not distressed. She seemed to be following a process she knew well, as if each of Caleb's reactions was within expectations. His breathing, which had previously been short and disordered, began to alternate between moments of tension and long sighs, as if his body were trying to adapt to something that was finally being released after days of being trapped. The change was subtle, yet evident. Sweat was now pouring down so profusely that the sheet beneath Caleb began to soak through, creating dark stains that spread rapidly. Ethan watched, impressed by the transformation. It seemed as if his father's entire body was expelling something, as if making room to breathe again. Caleb's pupils moved slowly beneath his closed eyelids, and his face, once rigid with pain, began to relax almost imperceptibly. Even so, the tension in the air remained, as if everyone knew the process was not yet over. Rowena tilted her head, assessing the rhythm of that release. Her hands remained in the same position, firm at the base of his spine and abdomen, as if they were anchors preventing the fever from spiraling out of control again. The healer murmured softly, not urgently but precisely, each word crafted to guide what was leaving. The candle beside her burned with a more steady flame, as if it had found the same rhythm as Caleb's breathing. With each passing minute, the sensation of heat emanating from him seemed to diminish inch by inch, bringing a kind of relief that no one dared to speak of aloud. It was only when Rowena closed her eyes for a moment, as if confirming something within herself, that the atmosphere seemed to change again. She slightly raised one hand, adjusting its position, and said that her body was finally responding, that the heat was being released as it should. Margaret brought her hand to her mouth, holding back tears, while Ethan took an involuntary step closer. The feeling that filled the room was of something nearing its end, but it remained to be seen whether the energy moving within Caleb would truly find its way out completely. As the heat moved out of Caleb's body, something began to change noticeably. His breathing, once so chaotic and irregular, began to find small intervals of stability, as if he were relearning how to function. His chest, which had expanded erratically, now rose and fell at a slower, though still fragile, pace. Margaret noticed this before anyone else, leaning slightly to try to confirm if it was real or just a figment of her desperate hope. With each new breath, however, the change became more evident. Rowena remained silent, intently observing Caleb's breathing. Her hands, still resting on strategic points of his body, seemed to capture nuances that the others couldn't understand. She murmured a few low words, as if consolidating the process she had begun moments before. The air in the room began to lose some of its oppressive density, giving way to something lighter, still tense, but less suffocating. It was as if the atmosphere was also breathing along with Caleb. Ethan took a few steps closer, not wanting to interfere, but unable to contain himself at the improvement unfolding before his eyes. It was strange to watch his father, who hours before seemed on the verge of total collapse, now showing signs that his body was finally finding a path to equilibrium. The sweat continued to trickle, but it no longer seemed to carry the same weight. It was as if the fever, so dominant in recent days, was losing ground. Even so, no words of celebration were uttered. Everyone knew that the battle was not yet over. As the minutes passed, Caleb's eyelids began to relax, and his face took on a less tense, almost serene expression. He wasn't fully awake yet, but the desperate effort in each breath was gone. Margaret placed her hand on her heart, feeling it beat too fast, trying to keep up with the wave of relief that was finally beginning to approach. It was impossible not to be moved, although the fear was still there, reminding her that everything could change at any moment if the process wasn't completed correctly. Rowena leaned forward and observed Caleb for a few seconds, assessing the depth of the change. Then she looked up at her family, and her expression, previously rigid with concentration, softened slightly. She said he was entering a state of deep rest, the first true rest in many days. However, she warned that the final part of the ritual was still missing, the moment when the body would need to be reminded how to maintain that balance on its own. Tension subtly rose again in everyone's chests, for even with the progress, they knew that the most delicate stage was yet to come. With Caleb's breathing more stable and the heat gradually decreasing, the room seemed to be in a state of transition, as if awaiting the inevitable outcome. Rowena stepped a few paces away from the bed and took from her bag a small, rough cloth, already soaked in a dark infusion made from bark and roots that exuded an earthy and slightly bitter aroma. As she unfolded it, the scent spread through the room, bringing a feeling of freshness that contrasted with the heat still emanating from Caleb's body. The family watched each gesture with growing anticipation. Gently, Rowena placed the cloth in the center of Caleb's chest, pressing it lightly to ensure complete contact. His body reacted with a slight tremor, as if recognizing the refreshing effect of the natural remedy. The healer then ran her hand over the cloth, making a slow circular motion, guiding the remaining energy outward, as if helping the body remember a forgotten path. The ritual seemed to enter a calmer stage, yet still laden with importance. After that, Rowena leaned over Caleb and gently breathed on his forehead, as if sealing a step that needed to be completed precisely. The breath, though simple, seemed to carry a symbolic weight, representing the end of something that had been consuming his life for days. The candle near the bed swayed with the movement, casting dancing shadows on the wall and reinforcing the feeling that this moment was the closing of a profound cycle. Margaret felt a wave of emotion wash over her, unsure if what was happening was healing, a miracle, or just temporary relief. Rowena took a few steps back, keeping her eyes closed for a moment, as if listening to her surroundings, picking up any sign that something was still out of balance. Then she murmured a short phrase, spoken simply but full of conviction. "Now the body remembers how to heal itself." The words echoed in the room, penetrating the silence that followed the ritual. They weren't spoken as a grand promise, but as the acknowledgement of someone recognizing that the hardest part was over. The room remained in absolute silence, as if awaiting a confirmation that only time could provide. Caleb's body seemed to rest in a different way, less tense, more surrendered. The cloth on his chest remained cold to the touch, and his light breathing signaled that something had truly changed. Still no one moved, fearing that any hasty gesture would break the delicate balance achieved. And while everyone watched, the feeling that they were witnessing something extraordinary filled the room, something that still needed to be fully revealed. For a few moments, the room seemed suspended in time. No one moved, no one breathed deeply, as if any gesture could undo what had just happened. The candlelight continued to flicker softly, casting shadows that stretched across the walls, giving the room a feeling of almost sacred stillness. Caleb remained motionless but different. There was a softness in his chest, a calmer rhythm to his breathing. The extreme heat that had previously dominated the room had dissipated, leaving only a slight warmth. Something natural, human. Margaret approached slowly, unsure whether to touch her husband or simply observe him. For days, his every movement had been unpredictable, full of spasms and fever, and now the contrast seemed almost unreal. When she reached out and touched his skin, she felt a shock of surprise. Caleb's body was cold, not freezing, not too weak, but at his usual temperature, like someone who simply falls asleep after a tiring day. She brought her other hand to her mouth, trying to stifle the tears that threatened to escape. Ethan and Samuel also approached, not quite believing what they saw. The sweat was still there, trickling in small drops, but it was no longer a sign of fever. It was merely the residue of an internal battle that Caleb seemed to finally be saying goodbye to. The two brothers exchanged a silent look, filled with relief and disbelief. The tension that had hung over the house for so many days was beginning to dissipate, giving way to a calm that no one dared to openly celebrate. There was still fear, there were still doubts, but the change was clear. Rowena watched from a distance without interrupting the moment. There was serenity in her expression, as if she already knew that Caleb's body would respond in that way. She sought neither recognition nor gratitude. She simply observed that the silence that filled the room was the signal she had been waiting for. The heavy energy that had previously filled the room had vanished, replaced by something light, almost imperceptible, but real. It was as if the whole house was breathing a sigh of relief after suffocating days. Even so, no one knew what to expect from then on. Caleb was still sleeping soundly, with no signs of immediate awakening. The family feared that the improvement was only temporary, a respite before another collapse. But Rowena, sensing the silent unease in the air, stepped forward and said that this rest was necessary, that his body was reorganizing itself. Her words brought some relief, but also left an inevitable question hanging in the air. When he awoke, would he truly be free of fever, or just beginning another unexpected change? The following hours passed slowly, as if time were afraid to touch Caleb before he was ready. The family remained in the room, taking turns resting briefly, but without completely leaving. The silence that had arisen after the ritual continued, now softer, as if the atmosphere were awaiting a final confirmation. The morning light began to enter through the window, illuminating Caleb's skin, which no longer showed the intense redness of the previous days. He seemed merely asleep, deeply, like someone who had finally found peace after a long torment. Margaret remained seated beside the bed, carefully holding his hand. She felt his normal temperature, his firm yet weak touch. It was strange to see him so quiet, for in the last few days his body hadn't stopped moving for a second, always gripped by tremors, groans, and fever. She watched every small movement of his chest, longing for any change that would indicate he was returning. Ethan and Samuel were near the door, exhausted but attentive, as if they feared missing the exact moment when Caleb's consciousness would reconnect with the world. The first sign came subtly, a slight movement of his fingers, almost imperceptible. Margaret thought she might have imagined it, but when he repeated the gesture, her heart raced. She leaned forward, calling his name in the softest voice she could manage. Caleb hesitated for a few seconds, but his eyelids began to flutter, as if struggling to open. His breathing changed, becoming deeper, more conscious. And then, slowly and hesitantly, his eyes opened, revealing a confused but lively look. Caleb blinked a few times, trying to understand where he was. The morning light seemed too bright, and the expression on his face showed that he was trying to piece together jumbled memories. When he finally recognized Margaret beside him, his eyes filled with a silent, almost vulnerable emotion. He tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out on the first try. Only after a second sigh was he able to murmur a single word. Water. The simplicity of the request echoed in the room like a sign of rebirth. Ethan rushed to get a glass, helping him drink slowly. Caleb drank the water thirstily, but without despair, like someone gradually regaining control over his own body. When he finished, he leaned back on the pillow, still weak but conscious of himself. The fever didn't return. His skin remained cold, his gaze present. The family exchanged glances, trying to contain the urge to cry, laugh, or hug him. But before they could celebrate, a silent doubt settled in. What did Caleb remember, and how would he react when he discovered who had saved him? When Caleb finally regained consciousness, he looked around the room as if the world was slightly out of place. He recognized everything: the bed, the window, Margaret's tired face, Ethan and Samuel's watchful eyes. But there was something different, something he couldn't immediately name, a feeling of emptiness compared to the previous days. It was as if he had traversed a confused dream, full of warmth and shadows, of which he only remembered fragments. The calm of the environment contrasted with the unease that was beginning to form within him, even before he understood what had happened. Margaret, noticing the confusion in her husband's eyes, sat beside him and gently held his hand. She carefully explained that the fever had been too severe and that at one point he had completely lost control of his body. She said they had called the doctor several times and tried every possible option. Caleb listened silently, absorbing each piece of information as if it were a puzzle piece. But when she mentioned Rowena's arrival, his expression changed immediately, as if something inside him had been abruptly touched. The healer's name stirred in him a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and discomfort. Caleb tried to sit up, but his still weak body forced him to retreat. He murmured a few words, trying to understand why someone like Rowena had been called to help him, and how this had been possible within his own home. His mind searched for logic in the situation, but found only gaps. The fever had erased much of his memory from the previous days, but the teachings of a lifetime remained intact. Practices like hers were forbidden, dangerous, contrary to his faith. Knowing that his family had allowed this deeply affected him. Ethan approached, trying to explain that there had been no choice, that the situation was desperate, and that they feared for his life. His son's honesty shook Caleb even more, who realized the weight of the decision made by everyone who loved him. He didn't feel anger. On the contrary, he felt torn between gratitude for being alive and the discomfort of having been saved by something he had spent his entire life condemning. It was a strange conflict. His faith guided him to reject what had happened, but his survival was direct proof that something had, in fact, changed that night. When he was finally alone for a few minutes, Caleb let the tears silently stream down his face. He wasn't crying from pain or weakness, but from confusion. He tried to pray, but the words came out jumbled, as if something inside him had changed and was still adjusting. The only certainty he had was that he would need to face this new understanding, even if it shook everything he believed to be immutable. And as silence filled the room, a question formed within him. Not about the fever, nor about Rowena, but about what God was trying to show him through all of this. When Caleb regained enough strength to sit up in bed, he asked them to call Rowena. The request surprised the family, not because he wanted to speak with her, but because his voice was calm, almost serene, as if he had accepted that he needed this meeting before any judgment. A few minutes later, Rowena entered the room with firm steps, maintaining the same tranquil posture she had had when she arrived that desperate morning. She stopped near the bed, waiting for Caleb to speak first, respecting his space. Caleb observed the healer for a few moments, trying to find words that made sense. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep discomfort, as if he were facing something he needed to accept, but which still hurt in his understanding. He thanked her, although the words seemed difficult to pronounce. He said he knew his life had been saved by her, even if he didn't fully understand how or why. Rowena listened to everything with a neutral expression, not seeking praise or justifications, simply allowing him to vent. After a brief silence, Caleb admitted that he had grown up believing that practices like hers were wrong, dangerous, and contrary to God's will. He said this without aggression, only with sincerity, like someone who shared an old burden. Rowena responded with the same tranquility with which she had conducted the ritual. He explained that he had never worked against anyone's faith, and that his knowledge came from generations who had learned to interpret nature as part of creation, not as opposed to it. His words were simple, but laden with a wisdom that transcended technical explanations. She then said something that deeply affected Caleb. Faith is not denying what exists. It is knowing how to recognize when God speaks through ancient ways. The phrase hung in the air like an unexpected revelation, opening up an understanding he had never considered. It didn't sound like an affront, but like a possibility. Caleb lowered his eyes, absorbing every part of that idea, feeling something within him rearranging itself. It was as if, for the first time, he realized that his faith could coexist with things he didn't fully understand. Rowena didn't prolong the conversation. She simply wished him continued strength and withdrew with the same calm with which she had arrived. The door closed softly, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts. The silence that settled after the meeting brought more questions than answers, but for the first time in many days he wasn't afraid of those questions. His faith hadn't been broken, it had been expanded. Still, the doubt remained. How would he explain all this to the community that had always trusted in his rigidity? In the days following the ritual, the Whitmore house began to bustle again, but cautiously, as if everyone was still afraid that the fever might return at any moment. Margaret followed every detail of Caleb's recovery, observing his breathing, his temperature, and even the way he slept. Every morning she touched him apprehensively, fearing to feel again the heat that had terrified her. However, with each touch, she found only the normal temperature of someone who was finally resting. His body seemed to have resumed its natural rhythm without any sign of relapse. The doctor returned twice, incredulous at what he found. He examined Caleb carefully, asked questions, checked vital signs, and looked for any irregularities that could explain the sudden improvement. Nothing. No medical explanation seemed adequate. The man who days before had been on the verge of collapse was now recovering with impressive stability. The doctor tried to maintain his professional demeanor, but the surprise in his eyes was evident. He left the house shaking his head, murmuring that the case would need to be reviewed calmly. Meanwhile, Caleb walked slowly through the yard on his third day of recovery, feeling the cool breeze touch his face. It was a simple gesture, but full of meaning. The feeling of freedom within his own body, something he hadn't felt in days, made him breathe deeper. He was still weak, but his strength was steadily returning, as if each step solidified his return to life. He remembered little of the fever, only disconnected flashes, but he perfectly remembered the encounter with Rowena and the phrase she had left behind. The family, though relieved, still wondered if the cure was permanent. But as the hours turned into days, and the days became a more stable routine, it became clear that something extraordinary had happened. There were no tremors, no hidden fever waiting to return, no signs of relapse. Caleb slept well, ate well, and remained coherent without delirium or confusion. For them, the cure was undeniable, but for the community, the story was only beginning. When the news began to circulate among the residents of Ashford Hollow, spreading in whispers through the streets, each person reacted differently. Some celebrated, saying it was a miracle. Others frowned, suspicious of the healer's involvement. And as the comments grew, Caleb realized that, although he was physically recovered, a new storm was approaching. Not in his body, but in his faith and in how he would be seen by others. Something told him that this healing would still exact a price. News of Caleb's recovery spread through Ashford Hollow as fast as wildfire. Within hours, people who hadn't even been closely following the situation were already talking about the fever that had inexplicably disappeared. For many, it was cause for celebration. A man known for his unwavering faith had conquered death, and for them this could only be the work of God. Some even said that the case would be remembered as one of the greatest miracles in the small town. However, for others, the unsettling detail about who had been called continued to weigh heavily. The more conservative members of the church began to question whether the healing truly came from God or if it had been the result of improper intervention. They avoided mentioning Rowena's name aloud, as if merely citing it could tarnish the miracle they wanted to believe in. They whispered amongst themselves that Caleb should never have allowed a healer into his house, ignoring the fact that he was barely conscious when it happened. Conflicting comments began to emerge, some laden with doubt, others with judgment, creating a disconnect between faith and prejudice that divided the community. There were also those who argued that healing, regardless of its origin, deserved gratitude. They said that if God was truly sovereign, nothing could happen without his permission. For these people, Rowena was merely an instrument, a channel through which something greater had been accomplished. These voices attempted to balance the debate, but were often drowned out by the more rigid voices, who insisted on maintaining clear boundaries between what was permitted and what was forbidden. The city, once so united in faith, now found itself fragmented by differing interpretations of the same event. Even after recovering, Caleb avoided appearing in public. He only walked around the yard or sat on the porch, observing the distant street activity. He felt the curious stares even through the windows. He knew many wanted to hear a clear statement from him. Was it a miracle or was it heresy? But Caleb didn't have that answer. Or perhaps he did, but he didn't yet know how to put it into words. The confusion within him didn't dissipate as easily as the fever had disappeared. What Rowena had said continued to echo in his mind, challenging everything he had learned throughout his life. While the city remained divided, the pressure on Caleb silently increased. People awaited a stance, a speech, an explanation, and the longer they waited, the more he realized he couldn't escape this confrontation. Soon, he would have to take a stand, not just for the community, but for himself. However, before any decision could be made, something within him still needed to change, something that would require more courage than facing the fever that nearly killed him. In the days following his recovery, Caleb began attending church again, but something within him had changed. Before, his words were firm, almost inflexible, always reinforcing clear boundaries about what was acceptable or not within the faith he followed. Now, however, his posture was different. He sat in the pews with a more observant gaze, listening more than he spoke, analyzing faces, gestures, and fears he hadn't noticed before. It was as if the silence imposed by the fever had opened up space to see nuances he had previously ignored. Community members noticed this change quickly. Some felt inspired by Caleb's renewed serenity, saying the experience had blessed him with greater wisdom. Others, however, were suspicious of this new attitude, interpreting his behavior as weakness or even a deviation from the convictions he had held for so many years. For this group, the healing performed by Rowena had left uncomfortable marks, and some expected Caleb to publicly repudiate the method used to save him. His silence only amplified the expectation and general unease. Instead of harsh speeches, Caleb began asking simple questions during church meetings, questions that disarmed preconceived arguments and invited reflection. He inquired about compassion, about listening, about the possibility of God acting beyond human comprehension. These questions, though gentle, provoked strong reactions. Some were uncomfortable, others were moved. Margaret observed everything with a mixture of pride and apprehension, realizing that her husband was voluntarily moving away from the rigidity that had previously defined him. At times, Caleb would walk alone to the edge of the forest, where the light filtered through the pine trees seemed to touch the ground in a different way. There he reflected on the tenuous boundary between what he had always believed and what he had witnessed. There was no denying the healing he had received, nor was there any way to erase it from his history. Gradually, he began to realize that his faith didn't need to be fractured because of it. Perhaps, in fact, it was being expanded, strengthened by the ability to accept that not all of God's ways were predictable. Even so, the city continued to watch, awaiting a clearer stance. Caleb knew he couldn't avoid this conversation for much longer. His return to the church had only been the beginning of an internal change that still needed to manifest externally. The conflict between tradition and spiritual openness grew within him like a constant echo. Soon he would have to say aloud what he was beginning to understand, and the city would listen, whether they liked what he had to say or not. As the weeks passed, Ashford Hollow returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing was quite the same. The story of the fever that had disappeared in a few hours became part of the town's collective imagination, discussed in markets, church gatherings, and conversations on porches. Each person told the story in their own way, highlighting what seemed most important to them. Some spoke of the miracle, others of the risk, and still others of Margaret's courage in making a decision that no one else would have dared. And behind all the versions, Caleb's silent figure became a symbol of something that many were still trying to understand. Caleb, renewed but more introspective, gradually returned to his activities. There was no arrogance in his demeanor nor shame, only a serenity matured by all he had experienced. He began to converse with the people of the city more gently, listening to complaints, doubts, and fears without rushing to hasty judgments. Even those who had previously seen him as rigid began to notice that there was something comforting in his change. His faith had not been destroyed, it had been deepened. He spoke less about condemnation and more about possible paths, about the complexity of life and about the need for humility in the face of the unknown. Gradually, the memory of that dawn ceased to be a source of division and began to be seen as a memory that carried lessons. There was no consensus on what actually happened. Not everyone accepted Rowena's participation as a legitimate part of the healing, but no one could deny that Caleb was alive. For many, that was enough. The town was learning to live with the tension between tradition and mystery, between the certainty of habit and the discomfort of the extraordinary. And, in a way, this coexistence made Ashford Hollow more human, more aware of its own contradictions. The pine forest surrounding the town remained there, silent and imposing, guarding the ancient secrets that Rowena knew so well. And the church, in turn, continued to receive worshippers seeking comfort and stability. Between these two worlds, Ashford Hollow found its balance, a place where faith and the unknown coexisted, even if in permanent tension. And whenever someone fell inexplicably ill, a comment would always arise. Remember the night Caleb's fever disappeared? It was a memory that challenged certainties and fueled the town's imagination. In the end, the story wasn't just about a man's healing, but about the encounter between two forces that the city had always tried to keep separate. Caleb learned this the hard way, in the most revealing way possible. And as he walked down the road that separated the church from the forest, he understood that his journey was only beginning. Life had shown him that not every healing challenges God to exist. Some simply reveal that He works in ways we don't yet know. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, share it, and watch the new story that's already appearing on your screen.